My parents always thought they were the smartest people in the room. They looked at my 79-year-old grandmother and saw nothing but a frail woman with an oversized estate, someone whose mind was supposedly slipping away while they enjoyed luxury ski trips in Aspen. They thought they could sneak into town, sign a few papers behind her back, and sell the very roof over her head to fund their lavish lifestyle. But greed makes people sloppy, and my parents completely underestimated the woman who raised them. When the moving trucks pulled up and the new buyers demanded the keys, my parents smiled, thinking they had won. They had no idea that Grandma had been 10 steps ahead of them for months. By the time their high-priced lawyer turned completely pale reading the final legal notice, the trap had already sprung. This is the story of how a neglected grandmother pulled off the ultimate countermove, and it all started on the birthday no one showed up for. My name is Chloe. I am 27 years old, and if there is one thing I have learned in my 20s, it is that greed has a way of completely blinding people to what truly matters. For as long as I can remember, my parents treated life like a giant ladder they constantly had to climb, leaving anyone who couldn't keep up in the dust. The person they left behind most often was my grandmother, Martha. Martha was 79 years old, a woman of quiet dignity who lived in a beautiful, historic estate that had been in our family for generations. The house was a masterpiece of old architecture, sitting on prime land that developers had been eyeing for years. My parents didn't see the history or the memories attached to the place. They just saw dollar signs. But worse than their greed was their absolute lack of empathy. The tipping point happened on Martha's 79th birthday. For weeks, I had tried to coordinate a family dinner. My parents constantly gave vague answers, claiming they were swamped with their upscale consulting business. But on the morning of her birthday, I saw my mother's social media post. They hadn't stayed home to work. Instead, they had jetted off on a last-minute, luxury ski trip to Aspen with their wealthy friends. They hadn't even called her. When I arrived at Martha's house that evening, my heart broke. The grand dining room was completely dark. I walked into the kitchen and found her sitting alone at the table, illuminated only by a single candle on a small, grocery store cupcakes she had bought for herself. She wore her favorite cardigan, her hair neatly done, waiting for a family that was never going to show up. I rushed to her side, apologizing profusely for my parents' absence, my voice trembling with anger. But Martha didn't cry. She just looked at me with her calm, piercing blue eyes and gently patted my hand. "Don't be angry, Chloe," she said softly, blowing out the single candle. "People always reveal exactly who they are when they think no one is paying attention." In that moment, I thought she was just trying to comfort me. I had no idea that behind that calm facade, my grandmother had already realized exactly what her own children were capable of, and she was already preparing her response. The days following my grandmother's birthday were filled with a tense, uncomfortable silence for my parents. When they finally returned from Aspen, they didn't offer a single word of apology to Martha. Instead, they acted as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. They plunged right back into their high society routine, hosting lavish dinner parties and driving brand new luxury cars. But behind the glossy facade of their wealthy lifestyle, things were beginning to fracture. I started noticing the cracks when I would visit their house to drop off mail or pick up my old things. The atmosphere in their home had turned frantic. One evening, as I walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, I overheard a furious, whispered argument coming from my father's home office. I paused near the door, my heart dropping as I listened. My father was pacing the floor, his voice tight with desperation as he spoke to a creditor on the phone, begging for an extension on a massive business loan. A moment later, my mother spoke up, her tone sharp and calculating. "We don't need an extension," she whispered harshly to him. "We just need to speed up the process with the estate. If we move Martha into that assisted living facility next month, we can clear her stuff out, put the house on the market, and settle everything before anyone realizes what happened." My blood ran completely cold. They weren't just neglecting my grandmother. They were actively plotting to strip her of her independence and seize her home to bail themselves out of financial ruin. The sheer coldness of their plan left me shaking. The very next afternoon, I drove straight over to Martha's house, determined to warn her about what my parents were planning. I sat across from her in the living room, my hands trembling as I spilled everything I had overheard. I expected her to look shocked, panicked, or deeply hurt. But as I finished speaking, Martha merely took a slow sip of her tea and set the porcelain cup down without a single sound. Her expression remained completely unbothered, almost serene. She looked at my terrified face and offered a reassuring smile. "Take a deep breath, Chloe," she said, her voice steady and full of an unnerving confidence. "A house built on greed eventually collapses on its own. Don't you worry about a thing. I've got everything under control." The very next morning, I arrived at Martha's house early to help her with some deep cleaning. The tension from the previous day still hung heavy in my mind, but Martha acted as if it were just any ordinary Tuesday. We spent a few hours sorting through old photo albums and dusting the bookshelves in the living room, the quiet hum of the house providing a strange comfort against the storm I knew was brewing. Then, just as the grandfather clock struck noon, a sharp, echoing knock sounded at the front door. I froze, instinctively wondering if my parents had decided to show up unannounced. Martha, however, didn't look surprised at all. She calmly wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for me to open it. When I pulled the heavy oak door back, I found two strangers standing on the porch. They were dressed in immaculate, dark tailored suits, holding briefcases and carrying themselves with an intense, professional formality that felt completely out of place in our quiet neighborhood. "Can I help you?" I asked, looking between them. The man on the left gave a polite, tight nod. "We are here to deliver the finalized documentation for Martha Vance," he said, his voice dropping into a formal, legal cadence. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. Before I could even ask who they were or what firm they represented, Martha stepped up right beside me. She didn't say a word to the men. She simply took the folder from his hands, her grip firm and deliberate. On the very front of the folder, stamped in bold, official lettering, were the words "Confidential Trust Realignment." Right below the stamp, bold and unmistakable, was my grandmother's signature, dated exactly 3 months prior. My jaw dropped. She had signed these papers months before my parents even went to Aspen. Martha turned to me, her face completely unreadable. She handed the heavy folder directly into my arms. "Chloe, take us out to your car right now," she instructed, her tone leaving absolutely no room for argument. "Lock it in your trunk and keep the keys with you at all times. Do not mention this folder to your parents, no matter what they say." I stared at her, desperate for answers, but she just gave me a knowing look that told me the game had officially begun. Months passed, and the frantic energy radiating from my parents suddenly shifted into something much more unsettling: toxic positivity. They returned to Martha's house not with anger, but with overly attentive smiles, carrying expensive grocery bags and acting like the model children they had never been. They bustled around her kitchen, pouring tea and laughing at jokes that weren't funny, trying desperately to mask the financial wolves scratching at their door. I watched them from the corner of the living room, my skin crawling because I knew exactly what this sudden display of affection meant. They were preparing to strike. "We just want to make sure you're fully protected, Mom," my mother said, her voice dripping with that synthetic sweetness I had grown to absolutely despise. She smoothly reached into her designer bag and produced a stack of legal documents, laying them out across the mahogany dining table with theatrical care. My father chimed in right on cue, nodding rapidly. "It's just standard medical and care insurance updates, Martha. With your 80-year milestone coming up, the state requires these updates to ensure your assets and health care are fully streamlined." I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs, ready to demand to read the fine print. I knew exactly what those papers actually were: a fraudulent property transfer disguised as standard elder care bureaucracy. If she signed, they would legally own the roof over her head. But before I could utter a single word, Martha caught my eye. She gave me a tiny, imperceptible shake of her head. To my absolute horror, Martha smiled warmly at them. "How thoughtful of you both to look out for your old mother," she murmured softly. She reached for the gold pen my father eagerly pressed into her hand. Without a single second of hesitation, she signed her name on the dotted line of every single page they presented. My parents exchanged a swift, triumphant glance, their eyes gleaming with pure, unchecked victory. They genuinely believed they had just pulled off the perfect crime, entirely oblivious to the fact that Martha's eerie, knowing smile meant they had walked directly into a trap of their own making. Exactly 1 week later, the final confrontation exploded into the open. I was sitting with Martha in the living room when the front door was practically shoved open. My parents marched in, flanked by a sharply dressed real estate agent and a wealthy-looking couple I had never seen before. The air in the room instantly turned hostile. My mother didn't even bother to look at Martha. She simply gestured wildly to the historic crown molding and the spacious hardwood floors. "As you can see, the property is in pristine condition," my mother announced loudly to the strangers. "We can have the keys handed over by the end of the weekend." My father stepped toward Martha, his false warmth entirely gone, replaced by a cold, businesslike detachment. "Pack your bags, Martha. The house has been officially sold. We've arranged a lovely, secure room for you at the assisted living facility downtown. The moving trucks are already on their way." The new buyers looked slightly uncomfortable, but they clearly wanted the property. I stood up, my chest tight with a mixture of intense anger and sudden adrenaline. "You can't do this," I shouted, stepping between them and my grandmother. My mother sneered at me, waving the documents Martha had signed the week before. "We have the legal right to do whatever we want, Chloe." She signed the transfer. "The house belongs to us now, and your little tantrums won't change the law." "Actually, they won't change the law," I said, a cold smile spreading across my face. I walked right past them, stepped out to the driveway, and retrieved the heavy manila folder from my trunk. When I walked back inside, I slapped it down on the table right in front of their high-priced real estate lawyer. "But I think you should read this before you call the movers." The lawyer frowned, adjusting his glasses as he opened the folder. My parents stood by confidently, arms crossed, expecting a joke. But as the lawyer's eyes scanned the first page, his arrogant expression completely froze. He flipped to the second page, then the third, and the color immediately drained from his face until he looked utterly pale. He looked up at my parents, his hands visibly shaking. "What did you do?" he whispered. The lawyer's voice trembled as he dropped the papers onto the table, refusing to look my parents in the eye. My mother lunged forward, snatching the document away. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her eyes frantic as they scanned the bold text. "This house is ours. She signed the transfer papers last week." James Mitchell, who had quietly stepped into the room right behind me, cleared his throat. "She did sign your papers, madam," he said with an unbothered smile. "But she signed away a property she no longer legally owned. You see, 3 months ago, your mother established the Vance Family Irrevocable Trust." The documents revealed a masterclass in legal strategy that Martha had executed in total secrecy. Months before my parents had even conceived their plan to sell the house, Martha had discovered their intentions. Acting under expert legal counsel, she had legally transferred the absolute ownership of the entire historic estate, along with all associated liquid assets, directly into an unassailable private trust. The sole trustee and future inheritor named in those documents wasn't my father or my mother. It was me. When my parents had fraudulently pressured Martha to sign their paperwork the previous week, they had unknowingly processed a completely void transaction. You cannot legally transfer a property that belongs to a protected trust. But the real trap was far worse for them. Because they were so blinded by their own greed and desperation, they had already signed a binding, multi-million-dollar closing contract with the new buyers, legally guaranteeing the immediate transfer of the title. By failing to deliver the deed, my parents hadn't just lost the estate, they had walked directly into total financial ruin. They were now fully liable for massive breach of contract lawsuits from the furious buyers, alongside potential criminal investigations for attempting to execute a fraudulent sale. They had completely outsmarted themselves, entirely unaware that the quiet grandmother they ignored had stripped them of their power months ago. The fallout from their own greed was swift and absolute. Within months, the wealthy buyers launched a massive breach of contract lawsuit that stripped my parents of their remaining assets. The luxury cars were repossessed, their upscale consulting business folded under the weight of mounting legal debts, and they were forced to downsize to a tiny, rented apartment across town. They had tried to leave my grandmother with nothing, but in the end, they were the ones left completely empty-handed. Meanwhile, Martha's historic home remained exactly as it always had been, a sanctuary of warmth, history, and real family loyalty. We celebrated her 80th birthday in the grand dining room, filled with laughter, close friends, and a massive cake she didn't have to eat alone. I managed the trust carefully, ensuring she would never have to worry about her security or independence for the rest of her days. She had taught my parents a lesson they would never forget. Respect and love cannot be bought, sold, or stolen. Looking back, I am incredibly proud of how my grandmother stood her ground. She proved that vulnerable doesn't mean weak, and that justice has a beautiful way of finding its path. Now, I'm curious about your thoughts on this story. What would you have done if you found out your own family was plotting against a loved one like this? Would you have stepped in the way I did, or handled it differently? Let me know your thoughts by dropping a comment down below. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and don't forget to check out the other videos on the screen for more incredible stories.